to me a much more working environment. But I shouldn't say that. Are you going? I mean,
No, I did. I was. Are we starting already?
Oh, I think we are.
Hello, good evening. I'm Kara Carmack, the Exhibitions and Public Programs Officer at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Spring 2023 Evening Lecture Series. We're thrilled to be able to host tonight's panel discussion entitled Everyday Multitudes, Looking at Raymond Mason Now. It's held in conjunction with our exhibition To Speak of Everything, the Art of Raymond Mason, on view downstairs through next Monday, February 20th. And we also extend a special thanks to our collaborators at the William Louis Dreyfus Foundation for their work in support of the exhibition and tonight's programming. Before we begin, I would like to note that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is free to the public with support in part by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional funding is generously provided by the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and individual donors. Please consider making a donation to help keep our evening lecture series free by clicking on the support button on our homepage. Thanks to those of you joining us virtually and here on 8th Street. We will reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the Clay Room for light refreshments. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. Christina Key, this evening's moderator, is a New York-based artist and curator who has worked with the William Louis Dreyfus Foundation since 2011. She has written essays for emerging and established artists, including Carlos Rakovics, Esteban Vicente, Jill Nathanson, Jack Bush, and Graham Nixon, and contributed to the catalog for As in Nature, Helen Frankenthaler paintings at the Clark Art Institute. Michael Brenson is an art critic and art historian. He received a Ph.D. in art history from Johns Hopkins University and was an art critic for the New York Times from 1982 to 1991. He is a Getty Scholar, Guggenheim Fellow, and Clark Fellow, and the recipient of a Whiting Creative Nonfiction grant. Brenson has been writing about modern and contemporary art for almost 50 years. His books include David Smith, The Art and Life of a Transformational Sculptor, which was recently published in October 2022. Please come back next week to hear more about that project from Michael. And he is the artistic director of the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. Leo Costello is Associate Professor of Art History at Rice University. He works primarily on European Romantic art, especially in Britain, and has published on art from the 18th to the 21st centuries. His first book, J.M.W. Turner and the Subject of History, was published by Ashgate Press in 2012. His second book, Early Turner, Seen and Unseen in London, 1795 to 1819, is under advance contract with Routledge. His next project will be a monograph on Raymond Mason. Beatrice Scaccia earned her BA and MFA at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Rome. In 2011, she moved to New York and has had solo exhibitions at JDJ Tribeca, the Katona Museum of Art, and American University's Katzen Arts Center in Washington, D.C. Her work has been included in group exhibitions around the world, including in Rome, Johannesburg, and Washington, D.C. Her work is present in many important public and private collections, including the William Louis Dreyfus Foundation and the Portland Museum of Art. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Kara. Can you guys hear me okay? That's all right? It's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I won't overload the talk with thanks, but a few are due. Firstly, to the New York Studio School, to Kara, to you, Ray Choi, for helping us out so much with this exhibition, and of course always to Graham Nixon as well, who who's been instrumental in helping this come together, and Rachel Rickert as well, who used to be the gallery director here. I'd like to mention her as well. I want to thank Raymond Mason's family and the estate for being so cooperative, and it's been a real pleasure to pull this show together. And I really want to make a thanks that the people being thanked are not going to like, but I'm going to do it anyways, and that would be my colleagues. That would be Marianne Costello and Tom Wood, who I can say behind the scenes did enormous heavy lifting in getting this show together, sometimes even literally. And of course, our curators, Leo Costello and Sarah Wilson, who might just be hearing this off in London somewhere, who knows. So big thanks to everybody for helping pull this show together and for being with us tonight, obviously. I'm going to just give a little bit of a start with one image here. Let's see if our slides are up. Good. Raymond Mason is, of course, I guess everything about Raymond Mason, there's a certain largeness I always feel that accompanies this topic. His output was prodigious and significant. He clearly was identified in a talk recently, an incredibly hard worker. You can feel that a sense of abundance in so much of what was done. So there's a general sense of bigness, I always think, surrounding everything to do with Raymond Mason. So I'm going to do a very short bio because I imagine many people in the audience are actually already quite familiar with his life and work, but just to give us a little grounding. And because of the scale of the topic, we thought it would make the most sense after that to have our different speakers each speak for approximately 10 minutes each. And this idea behind that was that they would simply say what they really wanted to say about Raymond Mason, what they thought the world should hear about this fascinating artist who has, been, as William would have put it, too much under the radar. And we just wanted to put it out there in that way, and then we'll have some more general discussion and then questions. So I'll just quickly, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Raymond Mason, just to situate him a bit, he was born in 1922 in Birmingham, England, into a self-described working class situation. He began studying art as a young man, was very much encouraged to apply for scholarships, and studied in England until moving to Paris in 1946. And at that time, it seems, despite maybe a slightly, the challenges of being there without too much support, too much funding, he began a life as an independent artist, one way or another, and really embraced Paris at that time, which was Paris in the late 1940s, which was just full of fascinating figures and people. He recounted his life in a book called At Work in Paris, and I have a copy there. It was published in 2003, and it offers just the most amazing accounts of his life and times there. And it's an important resource for those of us thinking about how he moved through the world at that time. He obviously met people like Picasso and Dubuffet, quite importantly formed friendships with artists like Giacometti, Balthus as well, and really embraced all the contradictions, all the vitality of Paris at that time. In the 1950s it seems to be the decade when he became more established in Paris, both professionally, personally. He acquired a studio in Rue Monsieur le Prince, which was very important for him, surrounded by artistic community. He started working in the low relief format, which proved to be very important for him, a significant part of his work. And moving into the 60s, very importantly, met his wife, founded a gallery, the Janine Howe Gallery, which was a means of support to what was then a new family. And through the 60s and 70s began to get critical acclaim for what were becoming larger, more complex sculptures. Very famously in 1965, exhibiting The Crowd at Claude Bernard Gallery, which it was a gallery known for putting on ambitious shows, but this one really caught people's attention, and that significant work became very important for Raymond. And then we see later that he developed that kind of scale, that level of ambition within each work became a kind of model. And he thereafter did, in addition to his many sketches and many smaller sculptures, the emphasis of his career at that point was working on these very large multi-figured sculptures, which we know him for today primarily. Through his life, he became recognized both by the government of both England and France. He had a significant retrospective at the Serpentine in 1982, is what I understand, and at the Pompidou as well. And he lived until 2010, and we are very, very lucky to have so many amazing works, and I'm just going to go through and show a few here. We thought it would be good to just look at the images. I'll be mostly very quiet as we're looking through, and just to get a little sense of what we're talking about. I do hope, by the way, everybody's had a chance to see the exhibition downstairs. I'm hoping the years are clear enough on these for those of you in the audience. Paris, of course, the beloved subject matter of so much of his work. Oops. Let's go back to that one. Sarah Wilson spoke at length about this piece when she spoke in the gallery. These obviously don't follow a strict chronology. It's really to give a taste. This is the crowd piece I was referring to, at work on it. This particular piece is installed up in Mount Kisco, New York. It is a bronze of the crowd. And the Tuileries Gardens in Paris. Sort of trio of works. And a detail of St. Mark's Place. The aggression. This piece is also on view up in Mount Kisco. Now we're in the south of France. I didn't mention in my brief rundown, but that was an important aspect of Raymond Mason's life as well. He would frequently be at a small property he was able to get in the south of France in the Menabre, and he made a series of wonderful works from that region as well through his life. This is a part of a piece that is on view in Washington. For those of you who are familiar with Raymond Mason's work, this very significant sculpture, Forward, a monument for Birmingham, was unfortunately destroyed in an act of arson, and so this piece is no longer in existence, but we're happy to have this image here. It was inaugurated in 1991. And here we are with the illuminated crowd. A couple of views of that. And I'll end it there. So it's obviously just a little tiny taste of Raymond Mason's work, but it just gets us thinking and seeing his works. And now we'll move on to hear from our speakers, which I'm sure people are keen to hear. So thank you, Michael. And I will go.
Thank you. Can you move? Good. So thank you, Christina. It's exciting for me to be here, and it came like really out of the blue, and a chance to talk about someone that we all care about. And so I'm very happy to be here and very interested in what you have to say, and Bea and Leo. So we have 10 minutes, and I thought I just had a million thoughts that came through my mind, like I'm sure we all did. And I wanted to begin originally by talking about my first encounter with Raymond's work in 1967, which was in a course in modern sculpture, which also a course that I learned about Giacometti and David Smith, and seeing his work in a magazine and just the impact of the graphic incisiveness of those plaster reliefs. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the crowd, which came a little bit later, and the impact of that with that kind of geological energy that the work had, and the canyons and the crevices, and the ways in which the human animal for Raymond was connected to the fundamental energies of the earth and the city. But I'm not going to do that.
That's just a
In
tease.
part because I really want to try to stick to 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to follow a little pocket of thought. So I met Raymond in the spring of 1971. I was in Paris. I was doing research on a doctoral thesis on Giacometti, and I was trying to interview as many people as I could who had something to say about him. And I was led to him by Patrick Waldberg, who is kind of a Buddha of surrealism at the time. And I think he was the one who had written the article on Raymond and A XXe Siècle that where I first saw his work. Anyway, so Patrick told me that you should see Raymond Mason, that he has something to say about Giacometti, and I gave Raymond a call, and as I think Leo will reinforce, he was sort of wonderfully generous. And I saw him in his studio on the Rue Monsieur le Prince. This was the work in his studio, and he invited me for dinner. He and Janine lived on the Rue de Cardinal Lemoine, which is a north-south street, and where they lived was right near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, very near the Seine. And that really began a friendship that was very important to me. This work, and I imagine that some of you really don't know the event that it's commemorating. It was commemorating the end of the Les Halles, the big market in the center of Paris, which had been in Paris since the Middle Ages. And at a certain point, given the changes in the modern city of Paris, with all the trucks going through, it became a problem for the city, not to speak of the rats, as a kind of breeding ground for rats. But so they made a decision to get rid of it, and Raymond felt that this was an event, a major event, that it was really the end of the Middle Ages in the city, and that there was something about this particular market that carried with it the soul of Paris. So he spent a good 2 or 3 years on this work, and yeah, on the commemoration of it, and it did wind up eventually in the Church of Saint Eustache, in a chapel where it is now. So I went back to the States and came back to Paris in 1975 and came back to live there. And during 1975 and 1982, when I was brought back to New York by the New York Times, I saw Raymond a lot. And I really can't overemphasize his importance in my life. And I was around the studio, and he, can we have the next slide? Sorry. And Sharon and I stayed in his house in Manerbe, which is in the south of France, and you see a number of the landscapes of the Luberon that are in the show downstairs. And we also stayed, because of him, with a sculptor named Romain Blomberg, who lived in Lacoste, which was the next village. And Romain was someone who made very odd, kind of semi-archaic sculptures, where it's kind of hard to tell the difference whether an artist made them or the landscape made them. And she put them outside, and there was a kind of resistance to the notion of art and the art world in them. And they're interesting works. Anyway, I mentioned Romain because someone who wrote an essay on her was John Berger. And John Berger was part of that world. And I don't know how much he's actually been spoken about in terms of Raymond's work, but Raymond mentioned him a lot. And he had a house in the south of France, too. Raymond knew when he came to Paris, and he had plenty to say about John Berger. I mean, he was clearly a big figure in Raymond's life, and Raymond was kind of always waiting for John Berger to write the article on him. And in 1995, I don't know if he wrote one before, but could you give the next slide? So in 1995, John Berger wrote an article, and it appeared in the Guardian, and it was on this work. And he had some really interesting things to say. He talked about a kind of awkwardness or a possible confusion people might have when they saw the work. Is it a fresco? Is it a high relief? Is it a sculpture? He talked about a certain kind of very skilled industrial proletariat that Raymond was picturing in his work. That was also the proletariat that Raymond came out of in Birmingham. And he mentioned that this proletariat was disappearing, on the verge of extinction. He talked about this work and the tragedy in the North and the grape pickers as masterpieces. Those were his words. And he wrote a couple of things that I wanted to read. He said, "When I look at these works, I see them speaking of a kind of love that I know nobody will ever find in Matisse or Botticelli or Frank Stella." He said, among other artists, probably only Verdi had such an embracing love of the popular. And then he ended it with this remark when he was trying to encourage the readers to go see Saint-Eustache and go see this work. He says, "I've seen saints in churches and Madonnas and martyrs and the saved and the damned, but I've never seen people straight off the street except when they're sitting in their pews. And here they have a chapel to themselves and have been made sacred." Can I have the next slide? So I think you can pick up in what Berger's getting at in the iconography and in the formal rhymes between aspects of the people and the fruit and vegetables in the church. And I would also mention here what other people have pointed out, which is the smile of the woman with the crate of apples. Was connected to the archaic Greek smile. But also, I think that smile that she has, it makes me think of a sculpture that was important at the time, which is and it's simply called the Smile of Reims. And it's a smile of an angel on the Cathedral of Reims. And that angel was destroyed in bombing during World War I. It was put back together, and then it became a symbol of survival. So its presence, presence of this history and the particular way in which Raymond used these images of the past to bring a certain kind of sacredness to the people that he cared about. Now, this particular, and this is what I want to end with, what Berger said, it set in motion a kind of thought that I had, and it got me to dabbling in Malraux, who Raymond read, and he met when Malraux was the Minister of France, and Malraux, in fact, admired his work. And it's essentially this, that going back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then all the way through Western art, there was a way in which the human figure, the way in which artists struggled with appearances, and that way of working with the figure, with the head and with the body, was a way of dealing with fundamental aspects of the human being. Like the sacred and the damned, the fullness of what a human being was, and also fundamentally the mystery of the human. And through the ages, the human figure continued to carry this kind of possibility that each period in history had its own style. When that style ran out, the next period would come along and reinvent it, and the issues that were possible to engage through the human figure then were continually carried on. This metamorphosis of the gods or of the human, it was essential to the human figure down through history. So obviously we get to the late 19th century and things start to break down. And Raymond was very interested in he loved Van Gogh. I think he was interested in Rodin, certainly to some degree in Manet. But then in the 20th century, with the move into abstraction, and when you think about it, pretty much all the artists of abstraction, they started with the figure and they left the figure and moved into abstraction with the implicit idea that the figure wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't good enough anymore to deal with the demands of another age and of another century. Giacometti kind of reversed that because he started off working from nature. If you can put the next slide on. He started off working from nature, then he passed through Cubism and Surrealism, which Raymond would define as, quote, modern art. And then it was the modern art that wasn't enough. So he moved back to the figure and the model. And he created a possibility of a path, of a legitimacy, of a way of working through the figure that was close to what Raymond believed and what he believed was essential in the late 40s and after World War II. So Giacometti really opened that up, and then he was friendly with Balthus and Bacon as well. So I'm just going to end with this remark, and it comes from the Edwards monograph on Raymond. And it's referring to Miklos Bokor, who was a Hungarian-French painter who came through Auschwitz and survived it and lived in Paris. While being rooted in appearances, work on Miklos Bokor, the being of this is Raymond, the being of the genuine artist goes so resolutely elsewhere that it becomes inhabited by the outside. So my question would be, a closing question for someone for whom it was so important to work in the street and in the immediate world. What do these ideas, what does the elsewhere and what does the outside tell us, or where does it lead us in terms of thinking about the work?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Leah.
Thanks, Michael. And I'll say, for me, this is, I feel a bit selfish. I am now working on Raymond as the next big project. So for me, I mainly want to hear what everybody has to say about it. I'm sort of gathering all of this in real time as we're speaking. So thank you so much. And the first thing I would say is that I'm very genuine. And actually, I'm going to put my phone over, not because I'm expecting a call, but for the 10 minutes, because if I start saying what I want to about Raymond, it'll go a lot longer.
And let me know if you want me to show any images.
Sure, yeah, I will. It's great on the departure for the moment. That the first thing is I'm so genuine in simply wanting this conversation and this exhibition as a prompt to these conversations happening. And as I'm listening to you, Michael, and thinking about Berger and Malraux and your own work, that, these things have been said about Raymond. It's easy to feel like, and I do certainly, I wouldn't be writing a book if I didn't think there wasn't a lot more that needed to be said. But these things are also out there a little bit. And part of the question for me is why then that discussion, like the bits are there for it, and it's as though they haven't quite coalesced. And so my real fundamental interest, and I'll be quite genuine about this in the book, is simply to start that conversation or further it at that point a little bit more. So some things for me that come to mind, and I'll say I do have a personal connection to Raymond as well. due to circumstance, it's happened that I've been looking at Raymond's work for as long as I can remember, literally. As a very small child, I remember, if you go down to the gallery, the hand that is actually in 3 places, well, 4 places. The bronze hand that's in the video room, also the drawing of it. It also appears, of course, on the catalogs. And if you look in the illuminated crowd, it's there again, sticking up like this. I remember being actually absolutely terrified by that hand as a child, and frankly, by a lot of Raymond's work. It was a strange set of images to grow up around. And I sensed throughout, and I think this gets to precisely the points you were closing with, and Michael, that there was something at stake in Raymond's work that could be, and the only things that didn't scare me as much were the landscapes, right? And now I can go back and find elements of that in it, but that there was something at stake in there that was not wholly reassuring, and that was nonetheless also not nihilist. So the first thing I would say about Raymond is that the title of this exhibition came from his own concept and his own statements about an art that was full, and you used that word as well. And it's art that's full of people, and I suppose that explains why they can be a little scary, because people can be that way, crowds can be that way. So I'm interested, though, now in, and I may as well say I pressed a little bit for the title of this session to include the word now. So for me now, I want to come back to this work, and I also think that it's a moment to come back to it. From my perspective, being in graduate school at a different moment, I think the reason that those pieces are there and haven't been put together to talk about Raymond as much is that, for me, the work will be, and you're right that it can be difficult, and I think it's okay for aspects of it to be difficult, but coming out of the 60s and 70s, and not only the Greenbergian moment when painting sculpture was sort of the last thing that Greenberg could have imagined, and in many ways, like, have been past Greenberg for a long time. But I also think that it haunts the discourse much more than it should, and that I'm really interested in coming back to what other things can be opened up about Raymond's work, separate of that discourse, separate also of a discourse of minimalism. Raymond's work is, to me, not only anti-Greenbergian, but powerfully anti-minimalist, and not necessarily in the most obvious ways, certainly in the amount of material that's there, that's present, but also in its response to the viewer, and of course, hearing you mention John Hopkins brings Michael Fried to mind, and the idea of absorption and theatricality, which are based on the response to the viewer. And for Fried, the cardinal sin of art was to acknowledge that it was to be looked at, that it was to be seen. Whereas to me, Raymond's art is predicated on nothing but that. Nothing but that, and that its response in every way takes the viewer into account, and is full of that, and is full of him too. So I didn't think of this until today, but there's a picture in the video gallery downstairs of Raymond sort of sitting in the middle of the assemblage that would be of the different casts of, oh, it is, oh, there you go. I love this picture. I could talk I could use all of my time about this picture and that deadpan expression, but there's something little, and once you notice it, there are a number of pictures there of him in the work, right? But this one is very particular to me in the way that he almost looks like he's trying to hide in there, and he's almost trying to blend into it and into that scene. I love the different versions of the archaic smiling woman that appear in the picture here, and it is very frequently as though Raymond's looking out at us from that work. That's the most un-Freudian, most theatrical, and I mean that in its best sense, way of doing it. So I think that, though, with this, one way or the other, these large sculptural pieces have to be, accounted for, have to be dealt with and not avoided. I do see that people respond to Raymond's work in different ways, and often will like one portion of it, and then there's this but some of those figures, and the word caricature is used sometimes. So in my thinking of what I want to say about Raymond, I think that is completely wrong. I don't think that they're caricatural at all. For one thing, caricatures are portraits, and they're portraits that are like, the word I believe comes from Italian, caricare, like charged, like loaded, either with comedy or typically with satire, politically. These are not portraits in that sense. They're not identifiable people. They're not being used to make fun of them. They're not being used for comic effect, either good or bad, except to the extent that it's a comedy that is broadly human, and isn't one where it's us laughing at them. But if we're laughing, Raymond's in there with it as well. And it's laughing at us, and it's something much deeper than that. The other thing I would say is that there's a tendency with Raymond's work to focus on, and this is why I found Michael's comments so powerful, because they're not doing this. There's a tendency to say, okay, well, the formal qualities of these pictures may make me, may put me in an uncertain space. Their theatrical address may put me in an uncertain space relative to what I've been accustomed to seeing. But we can talk about them in terms of content, what the material and what the message is. And I do think that that's powerfully important with Raymond. And I do think that the question of class with this, with the mining disaster clearly, are speaking to a certain set of issues that for me connect him more broadly with a discourse of realism. And I think that's been appreciated relative to Raymond, and I think it's one of the ways in which his work, it's more than that it's not just that it's figural and that it's invested in an ongoing sense of the importance of figuration, but also in realism, in the ability of art to speak to the world as it is, in its flawed qualities, in its absurd qualities, in its terrifying qualities, in its joyful qualities. That message is important, but I do also think that we have to maintain a focus on the formal with Raymond and the complexity of that. If you'll go to the illuminated crowd drawing now, the last thing I'll say, and Michael and I have corresponded a little bit about this, is I really want to revisit the sort of idea of painted sculpture on the one hand, but just as we were writing of it, I've always thought of these as polychrome sculptures rather than paintings. And I think there's a sense in which it is also they're painted They're not, painted sculptures. They're three-dimensional paintings, in a sense, and the role of painting in that. And he used the phrase about drawing an articulated three-dimensional attack on the paper, which is incredible. And as I look at this drawing, I was just again in the galleries before, and thinking about how sculptural the drawing it is, to the extent that I can picture, and it helped that I was standing with my back to the sculpture at the point at which I was looking at it, but as I look at that drawing, I can picture the other side of the sculpture with it. I know what's there, and that sculpture came after this drawing, right? I know what's on the other side of it. That's an incredible sense of formal response to the paper, to an imagined three-dimensional space at that point, that then the sculpture, as I look at it, and I said something similar, and okay. You get the idea. I think all of that needs to be revisited. That's happening in the St. Mark's. It's happening in the sculpture itself, which is both really three-dimensional and really actually one-dimensional when you stand in front of it. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Leah. There's so much to pick up on in everything you guys are saying, so it's quite remarkable. And Bea, and
So-
I'm happy to show any images you like.
The illuminated crowd, but the model. Yeah, this one is good.
This one.
Mhm. So my contribution to this conversation will be completely different in a way because I didn't know Mason and I got exposed to the work thanks to William when I met William. And I remember after a brief conversation with him, he right away asked me if I knew who Raymond Mason was, and I didn't. So he invited me to the foundation and he showed me the work around. Too much, and I didn't know what to feel. So I left the foundation a little bit confused, but I remember I still couldn't stop thinking about the work, and that usually means something to me. And then I kept going back to the foundation many times, and William had a very physical relationship with the works, so he would be very close to the sculpture and touch them. And so I got close to the illuminated crowd, and I began appreciating the indentations and the way he designed the light, and the composition looked so complex all of a sudden, so I began really liking the work, and particularly the back figures, the one in the dark, that are all contorted, and they are disturbing. And so that was the first work that actually I could feel something about. And I'm an artist, so I tend to be intuitive about the work. But when I saw that Mason had written a book, of course I got it. And I began reading at work in Paris. And I remember I was reading this description of Giacometti that he writes. And it's a pretty clever description. He talks about his head being too big for his body, and his eyes being very charming and having a prominent nose, and the mouth being a wide gash. And I remember I was laughing about it, and then all of a sudden the sentence, all these features being knitted together by skin, came up. And I thought, oh wow, this is disturbing. It's a very strong, image that the features were knitted together by skin. And I don't know why, the image kind of gave me a key to enter the work, because I felt it was his vision of humanity in a way. And so I felt, because I always felt reading about him, there was this discrepancy about what we all know about Mason, that he wanted to reach a wide audience, he wanted to reach a universal audience, he didn't care about the inside audience of the artwork. But then there was something I couldn't understand about the actual making of the work. And that sentence, the being knitted together by skin, made me think about, something that is very fragile, something that is almost like can fall apart easily. And I began studying the phases and the landscape and everything connected with his work. And this component of something that is extremely dramatic about his work. I can perceive it, like something deeply existential about the way he represented the faces. And I'm not, I agree that it's not caricature, but it's grotesque. And the grotesque is one of the most important qualities of art, in my opinion. When something grotesque and it's macabre, it makes you think about the funny, the funny condition of existence that we all share together. So this was my way of seeing the work and getting close to the work. And then I remember seeing Pizza Pazza, the San Mark. It's a very famous, yeah. And in the book, in the book, he describes the situation that happened and the reason why he thought of this work. He describes that he was sitting by the window of this coffee shop, and there was this Italian man, Tony Provenzano, serving him food and telling him about all the characters outside, and he began thinking about that they were almost stuck outside the window. So there is always this view that he has on human beings. They are all performers. So I thought about In Praise of Folly too, the Erasmus piece, in which he talks about us being all performers and coming out in and out of the stage. And then, but the thing I love the most about his work is that when I stand by it, I thought I was in front of some kind of disturbing snow globe situation because the scene is enclosed.
Like a snow globe, yeah.
Yeah, so it's something that usually happens outside. And in a way, I can see it from a different point of view. And there is so much happening in there. And the movements are frozen. And the frozen movements, I think, those are I think that's the reason why we always talk about caricature. It's not only the faces because of the frozen movement, because if I think about essays like The Laughter, the movement being frozen is one of the components that creates something that is laughable. So this scene being frozen with all this funny character inside can create the sense. But also, something I noticed tonight for the first time while looking at these are paintings. And I never noticed before. If you see this, like this, it's a beautiful painting with an amazing composition, and it's something that it's very unique about his work because, it's a claustrophobic quality to it, but something's happening in the art world right now, and we are going back to the human figure being at the center, and to color and to painting. So if I think about, Nicole Eisman crowds, there is some similarities that I like about this. So I feel it's a deeply contemporary artist. And I'm gonna say also that when you reject a work, but you cannot forget it, usually you end up really responding to it. So I think it takes a while to understand Mason. It's not an easy thing. It's such a unique artist. It's so, we are used to New York, we go around galleries and we see all this polished work and these empty galleries, and this is a lot, so it takes a while, yeah.
It truly is a lot. Thank you so much. One line jumped out at me, Leah, that you said that he's really dealing with the world as it is, or that quality, that refrain often runs through talk around Mason. I'll keep this brief and I'll end it in a question, but for me there's been kind of this constellation of things that I go back to when thinking of Mason. One thing I always think is interesting, that as a child apparently, he says in his writing that he would do watercolors of actual things, that he would forgo what he would say most kids would do, fantasy drawings and imaginary things, and he liked to do watercolors of things, and as he mentions that he would glue it to a piece of plywood and then have it jigsawed out. As a child, his father would help him do that, as an instinct to make a real thing as opposed to a fantasy drawing. I think it's just one interesting bit of information. I think it was Andrew Woolbright, I hope I have that right, who in his recent talk said, they're so clear, they're just like in my head. He said I could see them any minute. And then I think of Sarah Wilson talking about this vision she has of Mason, not unlike you, Leo, talking about him surrounded by sculptures. When he was painting lovingly, each leaf, she said, on the vineyard, the grape pickers sculpture, every leaf green. Interestingly, not shades of green or varieties of green, but that idea of the localized color being green. What I'm kind of getting to is this one-to-one directness, this relationship to the world as it is. And I bring it up because I think it's a kind of question for me. I think that aspect of his relationship to the world it might be a little bit at the crux of why some people really respond to the work and some people are hesitant about it. Garth Evans recently, in that the Sculpture Forum talk, which was very interesting, he said, he said, what the problem is that he's not, if I may be allowed to paraphrase him, he said that it's an affirmation of the world as we know it, but it's not necessarily deepening my knowledge. It's affirming what we already know. And that idea of the affirmation of the world as it is, that to me is this really stubbornly interesting quality in Mason's work that I can't quite get around. And I'm just curious how you guys feel about that quality of directness, which I think, and how rare you think it is, and how do you think it relates to works today as a contemporary, seen through a contemporary lens? Michael, yeah.
I guess I wonder about this idea of the world as it is, because it's such a particular world that he's constantly drawn to. It's basically it's a working class world, and it's the world that he comes from, and that he's stayed close to, and where there's some relationship to the idea of the people. So there's a tremendous amount that he leaves out, that he's not interested in, and a kind of truthfulness I think he finds to his own for his own experience through a particular relationship to reality. Mm-hmm. So and then finding in that reality a basic drama and basic sort of emotional characteristics, all of which have a kind of depth to them. So it's a particular relationship that he wants to human experience, and there's obviously a lot in the work that he has no interest in, and that's not there at all. So it's just such a particular relationship to the world.
Could you say a little bit about that? Because just that idea of somebody saying, well, it's affirming what we already know, which I thought was fascinating because it echoed William, who would always say that life should be in praise of the world or affirming the world in some way. But actually, as you say, Mason, it's not just a transcription of the world. Of course, it's an invention. It's a creation. Of course, his work is a creation. Can you say a bit about what he lays out? What makes it? Obviously each.
Well, I think that I think there's certainly a sense in his work that there's something in danger. Mm. And it's not just, it's a particular class maybe, but it's a particular way of dealing with reality through that class. And that reality has a kind of relationship to nature, to reality. I mean, I think, there's a certain language he used. He would have used that language. So there's, there's a great deal at stake in these works, and there's something that is always like in danger of becoming extinct. And what it is in danger, whether it's the owl, where he's talking about the Middle Ages and people who were connected in some way to the natural world, a particular notion of reality. There's something in danger that in a particular class that's in danger that he's calling attention to. So. Underneath it all, I think the situation that he's dealing with is quite extreme, mm-hmm. and he gives that extremity, a kind of extraordinary abundance in language, and deals with it in such a way that makes it possible for us to care about it. But the element of danger and endangerment in his work is very strong.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Leo, Bea, did you have anything you wanted to?
Well, aside from that, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I do totally agree about there being something endangered, and I guess my invocation of realism is meant to speak to that. That realism is not as a kind of movement. Art historically is not a simple acceptance of the world the way it is, but a committed, difficult response and determination to not avoid how things are and to precisely not offer art as something that would tell you that things aren't endangered, right? And that would simply gloss over something like the fundamental social, like the departure of fruits and vegetables from Paris is a vision of social change happening, and social change that's always rooted in some kind of power, and so the willingness to point to that exactly, it's not a simple acceptance of the world, and I think that's my thing with caricature is exactly to this point, that it's not simply taking the features of something and exaggerating them, but instead moving through them to something, and I think grotesque is a perfect term for it.
I think just to add, I mean, I think, there is a kind of extremity in the work, and in relation to caricature, that he wanted to push the notion of human expression, and in a face, like how far can you go with that, and the further you go with it, you in a way you become more human rather than less human. But I totally agree with the fact that in the end it's not caricature, like at all, and in part, but he's taking a lot of chances, and he's willing to go too far, take the chance of going too far, and I find that admirable, and in some moments he might actually do that,
Right.
But he at least makes you ask the question where that is and where that line is, and when he doesn't get there, wherever that edge is, he shows you something in the figure and in the face and in the human body that wouldn't come across in another way, I think, if the work were more measured.
Bea, did you have anything that it brings up? I mean, you actually work with the figure in your work.
Yes.
The question of, are these specific or general people? Are they of a certain time? One interesting relationship to your work is, the use of clothing, and of course he does, he does go back and forth between this, what can seem a bit more general, like this crowd, or St. Mark's Place, where it's as specific as almost every single figure in that has some kind of identifying feature, which ties in a little bit with this idea of, are they, they're not caricatures, but that question of because you work with the figure, what do you think about his instinct towards the figure as he's working? What do you get from that? I mean, I thought it was really in relation to what Michael was saying, was very interesting.
I think there is something very unique about the way he treats the figure, because he tends to overwork everything in a good way. I mean, there is something also that he says about it. He says, the more I work on the face, the more it becomes its own thing. So it goes beyond realism. He wants to achieve something that probably he didn't even know clearly what it was about the features. I mean, the clothing, of course, he lived in a period in which the humanity was at the center, right, for so many artists. And you can talk about humans like Bacon did, just getting rid of almost everything, and using the flesh to describe the dramatic situation of human beings, Or you can do it like Mason, like you add layers, and things get dramatic anyway. So it's another way to do it. But the result is always the one, it was trying to express something deeply clear, but I think art is never that clear. So in the way he worked things, there were many contradictions that I like about the work, and I think the good art is filled with contradictions.
That's a really interesting question, and it's one also that came up in an earlier discussion of the idea of doubt versus certainty, or closed forms versus open forms. And is it safe to say that Mason is an artist who leans more towards resolution? I think I personally, that's something that strikes me about his work, is that I actually think it's, as Bruce Gagné said, he said, this is a powerful person. I'm not sure how conversational he is, in the sense that he is giving us something. I'm not sure how much doubt, which, it's, maybe I'm contradicting what you're saying, but there is something very specific, very clear. And the more time one spends with Mason, the project seems, the whole idea, the whole surroundings, you realize it's incredibly well conceived, whether one likes the work or not. It's very clear, I think, in its intentions.
It tends to close.
Is that as safe? It tends to have these closed forms. It tends to have certainty. It tends to have, again, these localized images which have a kind of specific of time and place. So that question, it's very general, of course, but the idea of being open versus closed, are the works, do they reach a kind of resolution? I'd venture that they do, but I'd be very interested in any thoughts on that. I guess I raise it also because of the way people sometimes respond to the works.
I have something that it's very personal and probably is completely wrong, but I always felt that the way he works, it actually works. It's kind of in sync with the way, with the people he wants to represent. So this excessive labor, it's part of something that is probably psychological, but it's something that he really wants to do because he works hard as well. Like many artists don't.
Yeah.
They are more intellectual. I feel like the Mason work is a childhood, and the way he grew up influenced the way he decided to work. So it definitely, it cannot stop. So it keeps going until he achieves something that is pretty close.
Right, that it reaches that point. Michael, do you have
I
anything to say?
wonder, the question of doubt, because I think he kind of goes against Giacometti in a certain way, where, with that kind of that extremity of doubt and questioning that's in the work, and so, he's not going to go there.
Yeah.
But I think that nevertheless, there's a lot of joy and, ebullience in the work, a real kind of buoyancy, but there is also a certain kind of terror, I think. And it's interesting to ask what that might be about. So if, the owl piece, the departure, where they're heading into the unknown, and when the eyes themselves, and Raymond's eyes can carry within them so much expression, both hope and the opposite. But there is the sense something is ending, and he's not giving you something that can replace it, maybe, other than what art can do, and maybe a basic belief in human beings and what they can carry with them. So there is and a real kind of joy in making things, but. Yeah, there's. It's a question of where the doubt comes in, where the terror comes in, because it's there on some level, along with this tremendous joy and abundance and ebullience. But there's a sense, I think, of where things could just cave in and collapse, and they're where they're ending, they're heading into the darkness, and you have a kind of faith in them, that they're going to find, because they're blessed in some way, that they're going to find their own kind of world or reality that's going to enable them to survive. But just what that reality is, he certainly doesn't give you.
I see.
It's really something that he communicates through his belief in who these people are.
Right. But I guess interestingly, that idea of doubt is really built into the content of the work, the way we think about it in a larger sense. That he's not, he's just not Giacometti, and I think that's a really interesting comparison because he admired his work so much, and yet the differences are so profound. I thought that came up interestingly the other day. What do you remember what you said, Leo? It was sort of this idea of existentialism versus.
Right.
I forget exactly the way you said it, but when you think of the mood going into making a Giacometti and then the mood going into Mason, one is more open form and one is closed form or more fulfilled form, but it doesn't mean there isn't the same level of doubt about humanity. But the subject is very different.
I think so, and and to me, I do still see it in the in the Barcelona tram and the man in the street. There's that like existential sense of like it makes me think whenever you do the CAPTCHA and you have to tell it, I'm not a robot, I find myself sometimes thinking like, well, how would I know? Like maybe I am a robot. Maybe I'm lying here, right? Maybe we're not all here. Like maybe this is all a dream. Like that's the Giacometti doubt.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yeah.
Are we here? Is the person across the street here? Am I here? Right? What's the nature of that? Whereas for me, if you like look at the Luberon, and this would be the comparison to Cézanne. Cézanne, in painting the same landscape, seems at every moment to offer the brushstroke as some kind of response to that doubt, right? Is it there? I'm going to mark it to be there. With Raymond, like the thing is that it is powerfully there, and maybe some of the terror comes not from, the fear that it isn't there, but the reality of it really being there, as joyful again as these pictures are. But the same thing with the people, with the world, like it's there, and that certainty is the source not of reassurance, but of some of that anxiety. And I think that's where the grotesque actually comes in. That's the face of the other really being there, for better or worse.
Michael, I liked very much, and forgive me if I don't get it quite right, but your idea, you went way back to this idea of telling stories through the human figure, if I understand. That thematically things would, up until a certain point, were really always dealt with within the figure. And, to mention as well, you also mentioned this idea of a geologic energy in some of the works, and then you just hinted that you were going to tie that to the idea of the human story. And you said, I won't go into it now. We won't go on too much longer. I know we've gone just a little bit past our time. We'll wrap up fairly soon. But I just was wondering if we might get to that idea of telling stories through the human figure through time, or that idea of that sense of older time that you referenced.
I think I just wanted to mention that talking about the landscapes, there is this kind of geological energy, right, in the landscapes, in the Luberon, the drawings. There's something surging there, and it's a life force, and it's never something that could be completely controlled. You don't know when it's unleashed quite where it's going to go, although it is definitely a force of creation. And his people have that. The people who are leaving the market in the aisle, whatever it is, I think that we see in the landscape, in the face and body of the landscape, they carry within them, in his view, and probably because they are connected to nature, whatever we think of that idea, that it is that will enable them to survive. Like that part of them can't be killed, regardless of what is done to them.
Anybody want to add anything to either that idea or something? I mean, I have to say, I've moderated quite a few discussions, and this topic is bigger, it seems, than a lot of the other ones that I've looked into. And anyways, there's so many threads that have opened that maybe we haven't closed up tonight, and that's okay. But is there anything else you guys want to add before we jump to questions? I mean, there's a lot there. There's so much we didn't say about. Anybody want to jump in with one thing that we didn't that you'd like to add? Yes, please do.
I have one thing, which maybe is a bit of a, curveball, and I'm also not sure that Raymond would like it. So apologies, but I'd like to talk to him about it, even if I don't, even if I didn't convince him. But so I actually think that as much as minimalism as an art seems opposed to the fullness of this, the stripping down to some absolute core of things, I think in some ways, I'll offer this just as an idea. I think it's a false dichotomy. And I actually think that there's a way in which, and maybe this is like the Texan in me, but going to Marfa and seeing Donald Judd's things out in the field in a landscape, I think there's something not dissimilar happening there. It's a question of you, to the certainty, you are certain that that artwork is there, as you are certain that Raymond's things are there. And those sculptures are not to me in any way empty. They're actually, to me, full of something. It's a very different pathway to it than Raymond's.
So can I ask you, because I think it's
Yeah.
an important question. So we get into Judd. So the principles of Judd's work, in a way, the anti-composition, the anti-relational, the anti-narrative, anti-hand, anti-gesture. I mean, so that there was something fundamentally in that work that was determined to wipe out. I mean, maybe that's a little bit extreme, but it seemed to me that way. I certainly go beyond what Raymond was doing. So I can set up in Judd and Raymond almost as diametrical opposites, and to think that because Judd had the kind of influence and power he had, it made it very hard at the same time to look at Raymond's work. But seeing Judd show, it was very sort of clear to me what wasn't there, and what he sacrificed was too much. So in a way, if we're gonna follow the logic of that work, I almost think that it's gonna lead back to Raymond, because partly what Judd left out, what he wanted to erase in some way, is represented by Raymond, and he couldn't do it, and because we needed too much, and ultimately, thinking about this particular moment, I don't know if that sort of begins or helps to explain why Raymond's work might be necessary now. So, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and also the particular ways in which you feel that, in fact, that Mason and Judd might not be antithetical to each other.
Yeah. Or I should say purely antithetical, right? And all of those points granted. And it might be that I'm getting at something that happens, I think I am, in spite of Judd, right? In spite of all of that, the end result to me is at least similar in the sense that and this is, to maybe get it freed a little bit, and everything that he doesn't like about minimalism, right, is that when I stand before Raymond's work, I feel the work respond to me. I feel it respond to me. And again, maybe that's, my sense of a certain terror in that. Maybe I, since then, only really buy art when I find it a little terrifying, right? And so maybe it's to say I find Judd a little terrifying in that way, not in the sense of the nihilism, of the wiping out of all of that stuff, but of the sense that something very real is at stake there, and that the work of art responds physically to me in elaborating that. That's the only, and I did hope that would be a little controversial, me saying that about Judd, but that's the only way I would put it. And I totally agree that it's because of a lot of the results of that Raymond's work is important. I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think we will conclude our little portion here. It's fantastic. I mean, I feel like I learned a lot just in this one, the last hour. And I've been looking at Mason's work for a long time now, but I would love to hear from the audience if people have any questions, anything they'd like to ask this quite amazing panel. I'm quite struck by the differences of viewpoints and yet the points of commonality as well. It's really nice to hear Mason's work discussed in this on this level, just quite simply. And that's my feeling about it from these three panelists. And if there's questions, it would be wonderful to hear them.
Thank you all.
Yeah, great panel. I just wanted to turn back to what Leo brought up about the freed and absorption and theatricality, and that the whole problem of the address to the viewer. And I was looking at the slide of the East Village scene, and it suddenly struck me one of the weird things about Mason is that it's both, right? I mean, they looked like genre scenes, which were Freed's idea of the absorption. Everybody in the scene everybody who's being represented is involved in their own world and not paying any attention to the outside. And then the theatricality was the portrait, right? The address to the viewer. And there's both in this. The genre part is really strong. There's a ton of absorption. But then the theatricality is there too, but in a weird way. The hippie that's looking out at us and the guy with his hand against the glass. And I just wonder if that's maybe part of the discomfort that Mason's engenders, or whether any of you have anything to say about that.
Sure, and I'll be brief, and I'd love to hear from others. It might be, and another way to look at this would be that and I think this could exist as well, that the picture that they're hybrid, and the same thing would be they're not quite painting and they're not quite sculpture. I happen to think that this particular work really puts pressure on that, and does so in a really sophisticated way. So I definitely think that some hybridity, right? At least if one knows a Carl Andre floor piece is purely theatrical, right? It's 100% there. That was Freed's objection to minimalism. But at least you knew, right? Whereas this, to me, I think is everything about that. I like its hybridity. But yeah, I don't know what others. Right.
Other questions?
I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the exhibition we have downstairs is the first truly representative exhibition of Mason in New York for some time. And I wonder if you can speak to his reception in Europe and in the US and what that tells us about his work and about any differences or similarities across sort of how his work gets seen or interpreted across the continents.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Who should take that one? Bea, do you want to say anything about, critical reception either in Europe or in America, or differences you might see there?
I mean, as far as I know, the reception in Europe was always different of Mason's work. And it does make sense because there is a long tradition of what Mason quotes too as like artists that work with I know narrative is now like almost a curse in the art world, but narrative art, Hogarth and all these artists. So of course the eyes were more used to see something like that. I don't know about here, actually. I just know William, and that's all I know about the U.S.
So, I mean, in the 70s, when he was showing with the Gallery Claude Bernard and Pierre Matisse in New York, there was, certainly a degree of acceptance in the work. And I think he's always had like a core group of supporters, artists, other thinkers, dealers who supported him, who kind of enabled him to do the work and to carry on, and he always counted on, Yves Bonnefoy being, one of them too, sort of counting on on their belief. And I think the reputation was, in Paris he had regular shows with Claude Bernard. He did have the retrospective at the Pompidou Center. And so that's still the place by far where he has some kind of name or some kind of grounding. It's been very touch and go in this country. But I'm wondering about, Robert's question there, and wondering about the way, in some ways, in which some of this work, you're not quite sure exactly what it is, or what genre it fills, or where it can be located art historically. It seems like we should be able to locate it somewhere very securely, but I'm not sure that we actually can, and that becomes some kind of problem for it. I don't know, but his reputation has been much more solid in France. I mean, Leo would, you don't know that, better than I, than any place else. But he always counted on a handful of people. He always got a certain kind of support of a very strong and sort of powerful intellectual group, and that kept him going. That enabled him to make work on his own. But it's definitely right now seems to me completely up in the air. And I'm wondering if the questions you raise about this are they a strength or a weakness of the work? Is it a problem somehow that? And I wonder, even looking at the illuminated crowd and this and the aggression, I wonder. I mean, they're so kind of unique in terms of scale, and yet I think the scale can make it hard to locate them. Okay. So we're asking a question almost about the difficulty. It seems to be so completely what it is, but on some other level, it's very hard to actually find a point where you can establish a very clear ground for it.
Yeah. The phrase "hard to place" comes up so frequently in relation to Mason's work, and in my notes, one thing is that I think this discussion, I think it touched on it, is that yes, he's hard to place, and perhaps that's the great strength at this particular moment. That all of those things that have made him a little resistant to certain types of critical reception are perhaps a strength, and I think it's an interesting time for it. Was there one question in the back there? Yes.
Hi. I don't have a background in animation, so I might kind of be wrong about this, but if I'm kind of like tracing influences correctly, it seems like Raymond Mason has had a huge influence on stop motion animation. And I'm reminded of, the first thing was the three farmers in Fantastic Mr. Fox, but I feel like there are also just like so many like Oscar-nominated animated shorts that have characters that remind me of different people in different pieces. And so, yeah, I'm curious about if you think that I'm wrong about that, because I certainly could be. But if not, I'm also curious about that as a phenomenon, like having a very serious fine artist be so influential on animation specifically, and having a kind of personal style, if this could be called a personal style, be taken out of context, taken out of the body of his work.
Well, it's interesting. My daughter saw me working on this presentation, and she said, she's 8, and she said, I just love this piece, The Departure. She said, there's something so wonderful about, tomatoes made out of clay. I mean, she didn't want to, or a celery that's sculpted like that. And to be honest, I'm not familiar with any kind of relationship directly between any stop animators actually looking at Mason's work. It'd be fascinating if that was the case, but not that I'm aware of. But I think it does tie back into the feeling of sap in the work, the feeling of abundance, that kind of life force that you were mentioning, Michael. I think that there is that immediate appeal, which I think is a facet of the work. I'm not sure it's the whole picture, but it's interesting you raise that, because there is something so immediately tactilely appealing about the works on a certain level. So it's funny that you respond that way.
I actually, when the portrait of Mason with all the...
Oh, yeah.
So when we were looking at this portrait, I thought it could be an animator at Leica, the big company that does stop motion animation. So there is something that, comes, I'm passionate about stop motion, so I did think about it 30 minutes ago, so.
That's interesting.
But I feel I'm interested in your question, but Raymond, because Raymond, I see it in a way, but Raymond wanted to stop time, and sculpture in a sense could do that, and he was interested in the Greek. He was interested in the temple at Olympia. It was like a big thing for him, and the way a certain kind of statuary or sculpture could work. So I feel there's a lot of movement in the work and a lot that suggests kind of caricature and animation, but fundamentally the work sees itself in a certain tradition of sculpture that is working in almost the opposite direction of that. So I wonder if you take animation out of the work, whether you can do it in such a way that is in any way still true to the work, or if not, that it fundamentally betrays it.
I do like the idea of a Wes Anderson connection. I wish I would love to somehow show Wes Anderson these things, because I think visually, you're right about the three farmers, and I don't know. There's something to me with Wes Anderson's work that's so, it's so wrapped up in sort of humanity and its weirdness in the way that. And I mean that like in the best way. And there's something a little classicizing too about Wes Anderson's work. So I love that connection.
Any final questions?
I think looking at this work, and I've been around it a long time, there's a question of physicality to this and how you get to that physicality, how it hits you. And it's interesting you bring up Andre's work, because that goes to, that is such a physical kind of work that goes really straight to your nervous system and comes at you in that direction. And this work, to me, comes through your head, your intellect, and so it's coming, I don't know, you kind of come to the physicality of it through the storyline, and what's behind it, what the emotion is that way. And so in a way, it's sort of an odd comparison. Rodin, I thought, had a real physical kind of great quality to his work. Louise Bourgeois, I think, goes straight to your nervous system, and you don't have to think about it. It just takes you on. So I don't know. It's a question of. It's really a question of whether you want a story or whether you want an emotion.
But don't you think? I mean, Raymond was fundamentally interested in the notion of energy. And for him, it was always, it probably was an energy as a force in the world, but it was an energy that was always going out to meet people. And I think that and he wanted that energy to be communicated in an almost physical way. And I do think, in the sculpture, there's something always going out of the sculpture toward the viewer, and that was sort of fundamental to him. So I'm just sort of interested in the way you're seeing it, and in the way I gather from what you're saying, that doesn't come across to you, or the notion of energy doesn't come across to you in a way that's as interesting or vital perhaps as the other, as Andre or Louise Bourgeois, because there's definitely a particular notion of energy in Raymond's work, and it is of a physical kind, and he wants it to emanate and to somehow available even in a tactile or palpable sense. So I'm just trying to understand my experience of that in relation to what you're saying.
And maybe and I shouldn't have brought up Carl Andre, but I did so in part so that we could have like some kind of this discussion, and I wonder if part of it is that what's maybe I'm slightly flipping the way you put it to me before, but that like what's remarkable to me about Raymond's work maybe is the extent to which it can have that response, that energy, without stripping away everything else to do it. That it would have story, that it would have, intellectual, as a pathway to it, while still having that goal in the same place.
I think Mason's work it's just fundamentally polarizing, and having spent time with people, and I hope that this evening some of the ideas came across of why that might be, and you either feel the energy or you don't, but there's a lot of reasoning going on around that, and I do think I've seen it, that certain people are so struck by the energy, other people are, there is some kind of a barrier to accessing what is going on in Mason's work, but what I am fascinated by is that the complexity of the world that he is presenting and the forcefulness of it within certain contexts. I hear your point, Bob, that maybe not everybody is feeling that force, but that it's existing there. It does have this polarizing effect. I mean, heavens, as someone pointed out, he even had a work destroyed. There's a lot of energy there, and it does feel like when you start unpacking it, it becomes even greater. So again, that the tensions within make it more interesting. I do see on my clock it's getting time, isn't it?
We have one final question.
Okay.
I have my own theory on this, but I'd like your opinion. That do you feel like color and painting get in the way of Raymond's sculpture? Does that limit his sculpture?
I think if you like Raymond Mason, it's central to it, which is, I guess, what I was getting to with that idea of like the world as it is, the directness, the painting the leaves green. So I think you can like it or not, but I think it's absolutely central. I think exactly as Leo was saying, people often see the work and they say, but maybe not that, or but maybe not this. But I think it gets much more interesting when you take the whole package and see how you feel about it. But I think Mason would not be Mason without color in the sculpture. That'd be my take.
I agree. Yeah.
What do you think it gets in the way of? Yeah.
Well, I mean, personally, when you were talking about illuminated crowd, I feel like that's a masterpiece, very monochromatic, and what you talk about, it's showing shadow, depth. I feel like that's a beautiful way of using color, and it's very dimensional, and it's very sculptural. And his sculptures with all the color, to me, put it in a time and place, which is, for me, the 70s and 80s, and it's extremely limiting. And when I look at painting his sculptures before he paints them, to me, they're masterpieces. They couldn't be more gorgeous. And the moment paint goes on them, I feel it limits them. And the last thing I'll say is that I understand that part of Raymond's uniqueness is the juxtaposition of, is he a painter? Is he a sculptor? And so I find that fascinating, that that's the crossroads of him. And I personally feel like that may have gotten in his way, maybe in this time and place, as opposed to the 70s. But here in 2023, I don't think people get it. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for a great conversation. And please join us downstairs in the clay room for a late reception.